Next up, we have Dr. Richard Hunter, founder and president of Hunter Research. Dr. Hunter holds a PhD from Rutgers in historical geography. He has directed numerous cultural resource studies for various public and private clients, including the National Park Service, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, state transportation agencies, water resources and parks departments, municipalities, and major architectural and engineering firms. His firm has also conducted several historical and archaeological studies for the Central Park Conservancy, as we've just heard. Richard has considerable experience directing archaeological services in conjunction with historic building and landscape restoration projects throughout the Mid-Atlantic. He specializes in historical and industrial archaeology, meaning Revolutionary War sites, canals, mills, and iron and steel and pottery manufacturing sites, as well as historical geography, which is GIS-based historic and cultural landscape studies. Please join me in welcoming Richard.
Good evening. I'm an archaeologist and a geographer. I make a sometimes rather compromised and capitalist living in the private sector, working as a consultant in the fields of historic preservation and cultural resource management. My remarks this evening will be very much coloured by what I do for a living, so you will have to pardon that. A large part of what I do day to day is send out researchers and field crews to find archaeological sites, to evaluate them in terms of their historical significance and their eligibility for inclusion in the National Register of Historic Places, and to make recommendations for the responsible management of those sites that are judged to be significant. In most cases, this latter task will involve making recommendations for avoidance and preservation of archaeological remains, or where preservation is not feasible, for mitigation through data recovery excavations or monitoring during construction, often both coupled with public outreach. A standard product in all of this work is a technical report produced to a fairly exacting professional standard. Our company, Hunter Research, has undertaken several thousand projects over the past 30 years, each one resulting in a written document of some sort. Perhaps a dozen or so technical reports pertain to work we've done in Central Park over the past 25 years, mostly in the northern section of the park. So Central Park is one of the nation's premier historic properties. It was designated a National Historic Landmark way back in 1963 and was nominated to the National Register in 1978. It was made a city landmark in the early 1970s. In terms of the National Register, it's the subject of a somewhat ancient National Register nomination, now almost 40 years old, and it pertains only to the park in its role as a historically significant expression of landscape architecture. The park, of course, is a shoo-in when you weigh its historic qualities as a constructed landscape against the National Register's criteria for evaluation that are shown here. It easily meets criteria A, B, and C, and by extension, under criterion D, although not made explicit in the National Register documentation, archaeological resources relating to the park, i.e. the park's existing below-ground landscape fabric, as well as remains of earlier phases of landscaping, unquestionably contribute to its historical significance. But what of the archaeology of the pre-park era, which over the past quarter century has been coming to light in surprising ways? We now have documented sites and objects within the park from the federal period, from the Revolutionary War, and from the colonial period. It's not impossible that we will one day turn up archaeological evidence of the 10,000 plus years of Mannahatta's human prehistory. The National Register nomination of 40 years ago is conspicuously silent on the pre-park history and archaeology. Technically speaking, these archaeological resources, since they have no direct connection to the park, other than lying within its bounds, all require evaluation of their historical significance in their own right. But this is as good a place as any, I think, to start with the archaeology of John Randall's survey markers, which were put in place for the Manhattan street grid in the first half of the second decade of the 19th century. How do these markers measure up against the National Register significance criteria here? Pretty well, I think you will agree. Under criterion A, these markers, as essential guideposts for development, are intimately associated with the growth of New York City in the federal antebellum era and with the broad patterns of the city's history. Under criterion B, they are the work of John Randall, one of the country's foremost surveyor engineers, who has left his mark not just on New York City, but on countless other communities and several major canals and railroads across the country. Under criterion C, the markers are distinctive artifacts of early 19th century urban surveying. Ironically, criterion D, which is the criterion most often summoned for archaeological resources, barely applies in this instance, although the case may be made, I suppose, for these markers having yielded information important in history. So see the bottom one here. The overall conclusion here is that the Randall survey markers are without question historically significant and would meet the National Register criteria. I'll return in a moment to the first paragraph of the National Register significance blurb, and more specifically to the matter of whether the markers should be considered as objects or sites or both, and to issues of integrity. But first, let's attend to some basic historical background about Randall and the street grid, and then let's go out into the park and see what we have out there in the way of physical remains. In 1807, the state of New York, at the urging of the city, established a special commission to, quote, lay out streets, roads, public squares of such extent and direction as to them shall seem most conducive to public good. The commission soon after hired John Randall, a young surveyor and protege of Simeon DeWitt, who was one of the commissioners, who set about surveying the island of Manhattan and produced the so-called Commissioner's Plan, which was published in 1811. Randall was then hired by the city's Common Council to establish elevations for each of the new proposed streets and place markers at each street intersection. Randall started doing this in July of 1811, and it took him the better part of 10 years to complete the work. The cartographic culmination of this work was the remarkable Randall farm maps of 1818 through 1820, which most of you, I'm sure, know quite well. Randall was an extraordinarily rigorous, one might say, anal surveyor. He initially set temporary wooden posts or brownstone markers at the northeast corners of all the street intersections. Many of these were stolen or displaced. There was quite a lot of opposition from local owners, landowners. Eventually, he replaced these temporary markers with marble monuments or, where bedrock outcrops so dictated, with wrought iron bolts. This image shows a couple of pages from Randall's wonderfully detailed field notebooks. There are more than 20 volumes of these notebooks, all held by the New York Historical Society. On the left, we have a summary table for the whole island. The left column shows the north-south avenues. The next columns over show the numbers of stone monuments, the numbers of bolts, and then in the far right column, how many markers were destroyed. For the whole island, there was a total of 1,550 stone monuments and 97 iron bolts. Bolts account for roughly 5% of the total. 365 of these, close to a quarter, were at one time or another destroyed and had to be replaced. With this last column, Randall was trying to justify the time and cost overrun of his work, which was dragging on interminably. Within Central Park, we are dealing with exactly 100 street intersections. So that's along 6th and 7th Avenues, not including 5th and 8th. And from Randall's field books, we know that these 100 intersections were marked with 87 stone monuments and 13 bolts. The initial discovery of a Randall marker in the park was entirely fortuitous. In the summer of 2014, one very hot day, I was on my way to meet our field crew who were working on the forts landscape in the northern end of the park. I plonked myself down on the ground to have lunch as I was walking up to the northern end of the park. I had no particular spot in mind, and quite by chance I noticed in the grass next to me a very distinctive white stone which looked like marble. I poked around it a little bit and decided that it was thoroughly embedded, and realizing I was in the general vicinity of the intersection of 6th and 103rd, I did wonder vaguely for a moment if this might actually be a Randall marker. And then I forgot all about it. Our focus at the time was very much on the Revolutionary War fortifications. It wasn't until after giving a lecture at the Museum of the City of New York in September of that year that I casually mentioned the mysterious white stone to Richard Garland, who's a Randall aficionado, who had asked me if in our work we'd ever seen any sign of any Randall markers. At that point I remembered the stone. Mr. Garland and surveyor Lemuel Morrison then visited my lunch spot and concluded that yes indeed this could well be one of Randall's stone monuments. This piqued the Conservancy's interest sufficiently that the Conservancy engaged our firm to undertake some follow-up research and a test excavation. It was at this point, with some assistance from Marguerite Holloway, that we delved into John Randall's field books. So I've highlighted here 6th Avenue on the left, and then on the right highlighted is the actual intersection of 103rd and 6th, where Randall, with his square symbol, tells us he had set a stone monument. He made these notebook entries on December 16th of 1816, but he had evidently placed the monument earlier in the year, and at this point in the notebooks he was summarizing his work several months later, no doubt in some downtime as the winter weather began to set in. Another vital piece of relevant Randall source material is of course the farm maps prepared in 1818, 1820. Here you see circled the northeast corner of the intersection of 106th and 3rd. It's tagged as monument, M-O-N, and as well as some very helpful topography, much of which is still legible in the park landscape today. These maps are simply amazing. Now I'll give you a very quick run-through of images showing the field investigation. Here is the location today, as seen in a modern aerial, just north of the playgrounds. It's this star there towards the bottom. So it's west of the East Drive and north of the playgrounds. And the East Drive at this point follows the old Kingsbridge Road. Here's a closer view. And it was a gently sloping grassy hillside on the east side of a bedrock outcrop. With some careful planning, we set aside a day shortly after Thanksgiving in 2014 when we aimed to excavate a 4-foot square unit around the stone and establish for sure whether or not we were graced with the presence of one of Randall's stone survey monuments. This is a distant view looking down at the excavation location. Had a 2-man crew. Here you see the 4x4 unit laid out. The stone is deliberately offset towards one end, so we could half section the unit there and leave the stone securely in place, and at the same time leave enough room to do the actual work. So the turf was removed and carefully stored so that it could be replaced when the work was done. Soils were screened through 1/4-inch hardware mesh to recover artifacts. This is all very standard archaeological practice. We had a fairly steady stream of visitors all day long. It's very, very difficult to do archaeology in the park without being interrupted. And this is a jolly action photo here, just to show how much we enjoy our work. And when I say half section, so we've taken a half of the unit out, and we want to observe the stone in its stratigraphic setting. That's the purpose of digging the excavation unit in that way. So here we have a front-on view of the profile. This is at the point of maximum excavation, and it shows the profile that we then recorded through measured drawings. The monument is actually, you can see it perhaps set into its post hole. And here's the drawings that resulted from the work here. The plan view on the left, with the line showing where the profile view occurs, and then on the right, the profile. The stone is roughly 9 inches square and almost 3 feet long. Profile also shows the outline of the post hole cut down into the surrounding subsoil. We had no artifacts to speak of aside from the stone monument itself. So the stone was somewhat weathered and eroded. And how much of this is the result of wear and tear during the pre-park era or during the park era is unclear. Probably a bit of each. The top-down view on the left here, you can see there's a small chip visible, which we've salvaged and is available for analysis. We suspect, not sure, that that may have been a casualty of mowing the grass there. We presume the stone is from the Marble Hill outcrops at the northern end of the island. And on the Randall Farm maps, you'll see many of the quarries actually shown on those maps. The dimple in the top of the stone there is for the plumb bob and the survey setup as he was laying out the grid. And on the right, you can just barely make out the street and avenue identifiers, 103 and 6. You can see the bottom of the 6, the one on the bottom is probably the most clear. So upon completion of the excavation, all done in a single day, the unit was backfilled. And a discussion then ensued concerning how best to protect the monument. For the short term, the Conservancy redesigned the nearby planting beds so that they enclosed the stone. Marie showed a nice image of that, so that it would no longer be in an area of open lawn. It was decided not to remove the stone for masonry conservation purposes, certainly in the short term, to give it chemical treatments or whatever. And this actually would destroy its archaeological context, which we had left partially intact by not actually excavating the entire post hole in the setting. So it was decided to leave it be in its reburied condition. And it has reached over the years a reasonable equilibrium with its immediate surroundings, although in the longer term it's obviously subject to moisture, soil acidity, and the vagaries of drainage, all conditions which actually we may have altered somewhat by going and doing the excavation. But the deterioration, such as it is, would be very, very slow in just leaving it in place like that. So the confirmation of this one stone as an original in situ Randall survey monument immediately set us wondering, might there be some more of them out there? And soon afterwards, in the course of an informal walkover, we easily found another one at 109th and 7th. And the Conservancy then set up an expanded, more systematic study to consider whether other markers might survive. This involved mapping analysis and some carefully targeted visual inspection in the field. The mapping focused on the georeferencing of the farm maps, which actually, although they're very accurate, still proved to be quite difficult at the scale that we were trying to work at. Basically, we were superimposing the farm maps over detailed modern topographic maps so that we could then go and pre-program a GPS unit and go out in the field and look at the predicted locations to see if there were any monuments there. Based on the current conditions within the park, we settled on 11 locations to go out and field check, mostly in the northern end of the park, above the 97th Street transverse. We found 2 more stone monuments, so that's a total of 4 at this point, and then 1 bolt. And then in the course of doing a field walking episode in April of this year, a Randall aficionado, Mr. Garland, found yet another one at 96th and 7th. So here is a summary of the rediscovered survey markers as we currently know them. In all, we have 5 stones and 2 bolts. That's 7% of the total population of the markers in the park. And so that's 7 in situ markers. The table also shows in the 2 right-hand columns there the kinds of discrepancies we were dealing with between the geo-reference locations and the actual locations. On the left here we have an aerial photo showing the projected locations of all the markers in the park. Obviously many of them have gone. Many are in water bodies, many have been removed in the course of park landscaping. The survivors will most likely be in the northern end of the park where the topography was less altered by the park landscaping. On the right, there's a section of the farm maps again showing most of those markers that we rediscovered in the northern end of the park, along with their recorded discrepancies resulting from the georeferencing. So all were found within 10 feet of their predicted locations. That's the kind of accuracy we were dealing with. This is hard to see on the left here, but this aerial shows the projected locations of the markers again. Obviously, and we have on the right there a sample of the ones that we've rediscovered. So finally, just a few gentle sort of ruminations about how we should be treating these monuments and bolts and about their integrity. In National Register parlance, are these just objects? Certainly the 2 surviving examples in the collections of the New York Historical Society are objects, and very significant objects at that. That's what you see here. These examples out there in the park in their original surveyed positions, however, these are most definitely sites as well as objects. So do we regard each one of them as their own individual site, perhaps as a 10-foot diameter, 3-foot deep cylinder sitting there in the landscape? Or can we somehow group them together and consider them as a non-contiguous district? Should we be extending that district out beyond the park to include the odd bolts and stones that may still survive out there within the city? There's one bolt certainly that's known in another city park, North of Central Park. Can such a district legitimately include these museum objects you see here? The one on the left is in fact a pretty good match for the one we found at 6th and 103rd, although the numerical script is a little different. The one on the right is different again. It's much more finely dressed and scribed, and it's quite possibly a later monument altogether, although it did mark one of the street intersections. Certainly there is a need here to ponder and analyze these monuments in more detail and to more formally recognize and categorize them within the broader context of the nation's historic properties. Now to finish up with just a few words on integrity. As an intellectual framework here, I'll use again the National Register's 7 aspects of integrity, spelled out in this slide. As objects, sites, and as a discontiguous district, and as the most deeply rooted historic and living expression of Manhattan's greatest grid, these markers impart a profound integrity. The in situ survivors in the park possess exceptional integrity of location. As human-made objects, those in the park and in the Historical Society collections display a basic and simple integrity of design. The markers generally lack integrity of cultural setting, although the bolts in the bedrock outcrops and 1 or 2 of the stones in the wooded sections of the park might be considered to retain some integrity of their natural setting. They all possess a high measure of material integrity and workmanship, albeit the monuments are a little weather-beaten and eroded, while the bolts exhibit slight corrosion and evidence of a few dings. Feeling and association, the 2 bottom ones here, as measures of integrity require some imagination on our part. But to be in the presence of these monuments and bolts is to bond with Randall and his trusty workers and their concept of survey, and through this we gain some understanding of how the city, in its first truly organized phase of early 19th century expansion, took off on its trajectory toward the place we all inhabit today. The survey markers are the most direct physical link we have to the origins of the grid. Each of the in situ markers has its own localized archaeological context with a horizontal component and a vertical component. Each is embedded in a broader urban geographic context and serves as a critical stitch in the very fabric and soul of the city. So here we are back at 6th and 103rd, where this process of rediscovery all started. The marker is this little white dot that you can see at the very top of the slide, up there, that little white dot. It's a mere speck in the landscape. How do we communicate the meaning and importance of these marble monuments and wrought iron bolts today while protecting and preserving them for future generations? I've deliberately skirted the topic of historic interpretation here, and this is the Conservancy's challenge, and I'll leave Marie and her co-workers. So let me end on just one final, slightly more personal note. John Randall was a difficult human being, as shown very well in Marguerite Holloway's excellent book, The Measure of Manhattan. But he was clearly a man of some professional integrity. He was extraordinarily rigorous in terms of his surveying technique, his map making, and in keeping records. As we trail in his wake and rediscover the fruits of his labors, we must make sure we document our own activities. Hence, our investigative efforts, those of the Conservancy and its consultants, have sought a high level of professionalism and integrity and in producing these reports. So here we have two technical reports, the covers displayed here, which represent a step in the direction toward giving Ravel and the city grid the scholarly deliberation they deserve. Thank you.